So now what I'd like to do is show a few pictures of produce handling that I saw at some of the WIC stores, and just make a few comments and observations. Okay, so here's one. This I'm showing these in relation with water loss and just careful handling. On the left, for example, we really don't like to see cartons that are loose and open and stacked on top of each other. We want to see a little bit more order, partly because of physical damage to the products, and so trying to stack light cartons on top of each other and managing that becomes important to avoid that damage that we've already talked about. Regarding water loss, we want to see the cartons kept closed, because that provides a barrier so that we're not having water loss. And if you see the photo on the right here, here's a very large room in which the products were temporarily being held before they were put on the store shelves. And you can see that here now we have everything spread out, but the room itself is going to be quite dry. It's on the cool side, but you have a lot of air there that is relatively dry, and those products then are going to lose moisture relatively quickly, especially those that are not protected. In the photo, most of them have some protection. We have some clamshells there, we have bananas in a plastic bag, that type of thing. And in the WIC stores, we generally do see quite a bit of consumer packaging, and that oftentimes is to prevent water loss and also to help prevent damage. Those pineapples there in the photo on the right, though, for example, are quite exposed. So in that case, we would say that if you have a box of something, it's open, it's exposed, you want to put another empty box on top of it, or a clean sheet of carton, something to minimize then or reduce the water loss under those conditions. Now here's another photo. I hope you can see well enough here to distinguish some of the products. And one of the questions, or one of the things that I observed is sometimes products being held, basically we have two conditions. We have a refrigerator in all of the WIC stores. There were some refrigerators, and then we have ambient conditions. The WIC stores that we were working in and in which we were giving some of these post-harvest workshops, some were in Riverside County, where it can be very hot and dry, especially in the summer months. Another set were in Tulare, where also the temperature conditions, ambient conditions can vary a lot. And then the third set of stores were in Alameda County, which is generally a little bit cooler, less extreme conditions. So one of the things there is that if we have cooler conditions inside the store, many products could be held out here, as we're seeing in this photo, and they wouldn't suffer very much. They would be sold and they would be fine. But if the ambient conditions are very hot, quite warm, and they're very dry, then there can be very rapid changes in the quality of product that is exposed in this way. But regardless of what I just said, there's one product there that should never be held on these retail shelves like this in the open condition. It should always be refrigerated, and that product are the blueberries or any of the other blueberries. So those should never be merchandised by exposing them to ambient conditions. They should always be kept under refrigeration, mostly because of that decay organism, the botrytis that I talked about previously. So now there are a couple others. I say which items in this photo are most vulnerable to water loss. So these might be a little bit hard to see here, but the list that I came up with were the oranges, the grapefruit, and the kiwis. And that's because, again, they're open, they're quite exposed. The oranges on the bottom shelf there are in net bags, but that net bag just contains them. It doesn't really provide any protection. And the grapefruit on the upper left are completely exposed in a small, shallow tray. Those that are vulnerable to softening are the apples and the kiwi. So again, the kiwi are exposed. A lot of that softening is going to be related to the water loss, okay? But in the case of the apples that are next to the kiwis on the middle shelf there, they are in a plastic bag. But apples will soften at warm temperatures. So to keep the apples crispy, we usually want to see them in refrigerated conditions. And then finally, for decay, well, all of those are going to be vulnerable to decay, especially if there's some injury to the product, especially the blueberries, for example, except the onions and garlic, because those we can hold at ambient conditions for a fairly good period of time if the outsides have been what we call well cured, and we don't have decay. They've been treated very well and not damaged, then those can be held without really decay. So another photo, and the sweet potatoes on the bottom shelf. Also, sweet potatoes can be held under ambient conditions because, again, a root crop like that has a very thick skin that helps to protect it from water loss. Now here's some shots from another store. So the sort of the same thing. Should some products be held in the refrigerated cabinet instead? And so I don't see the berries in this case, but again, what I am looking at, what I am looking at here are the apples. Here we have red apples on the top shelf, and on the lower shelf we have some green apples, I believe they are. And so again, both of those from the standpoint of the softening issue should be held in the refrigerated shelf. Decay, again, it would be everything except the onions and the sweet potatoes potentially are going to have more decay, and especially in this case what I observed, there are some tomatoes. In the right hand photo there are tomatoes in clamshells. Now the clamshells will protect them from water loss, but because they're held under ambient conditions, if there were any decay organisms beginning to grow on those tomatoes, then they're going to grow very fast under those ambient conditions. And so that's where we might see more decay if the tomatoes had not been handled well and we had some incipient decay. You'll notice on the left there's a photo. I took that photo more for the plastic bags. Those happen to be avocados there. I'm going to talk more about that in another slide. So here's another example, and so I hope you can see I took this photo. Of course it reflected from the refrigerated cabinet, but here we have a range of products in the refrigerated cabinet. So there are some products there that I would say do not need refrigeration. Sometimes the refrigerated area is very small, and we don't want to be putting products there that would be damaged, and certainly we don't want to put products there that really aren't benefited by refrigeration. So in this case, I would say the watermelons really do not need refrigeration. The pears were very hard. They're down from the left. They're the third shelf up from the bottom. Those pears were very hard. So in that case, it would be better to leave those under ambient conditions so that they would begin to soften. Once they begin to soften, then they could be put in the refrigerated cabinet. So that's the type of thing that one can manage with these small lots of produce in order to minimize losses. And then finally, the limes. Many of the stores, because limes are a popular item, many of the stores were having losses with limes, and that was due to chilling injury, where when they're held under refrigerator conditions, you begin to see browning on the peel of the lime. And eventually it changes the flavor of the lime, etc. But at first you'll notice just a discoloration on the limes. So they should be held under ambient conditions, but of course they're going to be susceptible to water loss. So in that case, we have to have a good turnover of that product in order to have them under good conditions. And then there are some products that definitely are damaged by the refrigeration if they're held too long, and that would be the tomatoes and the limes. Now, both the tomatoes and the limes could be held in that refrigerated cabinet for up to 2 to 3 days perhaps, and they would be all right. But beyond that, they are going to begin to be damaged by the product, by the low temperature. Here's another example, and I put this example up here because we have some packaged products. We have some cut salads on the second row from the top, and with some spinach salad and some iceberg salad, and so all of those should be held under refrigeration. We have on the third shelf, we have grapes, so many of those products we have. Then next to the grapes we have some broccoli florets. All of those do require low temperatures, but again, there are some products that should not be there. The pineapples really do not need the refrigeration. They can be held at ambient conditions. Again, we have tomatoes that are there, and after a few days that's going to be damaging to the flavor of the tomatoes. Eventually we'll see more of that black decay on the tomatoes. And one that should never be held in refrigeration is the jicama root. It may look okay on the outside, although most of these did not. They already were looking damaged and a little bit slimy on the outside. But if you cut the jicama, you will see that it has internal browning. And that internal browning is due to holding them at too low a temperature. So the jicama should always be outside. It's like a sweet potato. It's a root crop. Keep it outside then under ambient conditions. So the products that are damaged again are the same. Now here I didn't put the cucumber, I didn't put the pineapple because it takes a long time for the pineapple to be damaged. I'm just saying with the pineapple it doesn't really need the low temperature, and in this case their cabinet was really full, so they could have removed the pineapple to free up space for another. But one that is really tricky to handle is cucumber, because it is chilled by low temperatures, but again if we hold it under ambient conditions it will turn yellow more rapidly and that type of thing. And so the cucumbers can be difficult. I think it all boils down to what are the ambient conditions if you aren't holding them in the refrigerated case, and then how long they would be held. And that's a case, and this is an example of where I think they could be held under ambient conditions, but simply have a smaller amount of product and make sure that you have good and frequent rotation of the product so it's not damaged by warm conditions. Here are a few other photos that I took. Here we have some mushrooms, and I think even with my not very good photos here, I think you can see that the mushroom punnet on the top right there has very old and moldy mushrooms. Those should never be on the shelf. They should have been removed. But instead of doing that, they added fresh new mushrooms on the left. So right there, you have products of two use by dates basically, and you do not want to mix products like that. And then the bottom line is, who's ever going to buy that punnet of mushrooms on the right? They're already a loss. It's a post-harvest loss. It should be taken off the shelf because it simply detracts now from the quality of the other produce, and no one is going to buy it. And then on the bottom right here, we have some avocados. On the bottom right, but the top shelf, there are green avocados. Again, this is a very popular item in many of the WIC stores. And the problem with it there is that they are chilling sensitive. And if they are green and hard, and you hold them under refrigeration, they will never ripen properly. So basically, what you want to do at the WIC store level is, if the avocados come in, and they come in various stages of ripeness, if they come in ripe, then they could be held under refrigeration in order to slow down further softening. But if they come in green, you want to hold them under ambient conditions to allow the fruit to go through the ripening process. Then once it's begin to ripen, and most of them turn color from green to dark as they ripen, because most of them are the Hass type avocado, then once they have gone through that ripening process and turned dark and begun to soften, now they can be put in the refrigerated shelf. So I think that's one where, again, understanding the biology of the product a little bit more will help to minimize the losses. And again, here's another example. We've got some onions in there, and they do not need refrigerated space. As a matter of fact, the humid conditions inside, the cold humid conditions inside the refrigerator will simply favor decay on the onions. So they are much better held under ambient conditions where it is warmer and drier to prevent the superficial molds on the onions. Again, here's some more example. More tomatoes in the refrigerated cabinet. They really do not need to be there unless you had extremely high temperature conditions. The jicama should never be there. And again, we have another example where we have some green avocados that should not be refrigerated. Now here's another picture, another example. Here we have some grapefruit, and I think you can see that some of those grapefruit are shiny, and some of them look pretty well beaten up and are not very shiny. And again, what's happening here is some product was sold, they added new product to it, so now we have mixed product here. We have old and new. And so my question, as I said to the personnel at the store, now who's going to buy the ones that look ugly? Well, no one. And so, you know, the ugly ones are going to get uglier. So I think that's a matter of not putting too much out for display, and certainly not mixing then the qualities. The one on the top left there, for example, it may be edible inside, but it certainly is not attractive, and probably it would not be bought. If we had it already at home, we would peel it and use it. But at the store level, someone is not going to buy that because it does look quite ugly. So either we have to then sell that more cheaply, or sell it more rapidly, put less produce out at one time, let the fewer grapefruit in the display in order to minimize then their exposure and the water loss. All of that, the loss of shininess is due to water loss, basically. And then the bottom right is another example. Again, many of the products are either packaged in punnets overwrapped with plastic, or also many of them were put in these net bags. And here I'm trying to show with these zucchini squash, the net bag is actually damaging the produce. And so those, when they're in those net bags, the plastic netting can be quite sharp and then cut through the skin of the product, something delicate like a zucchini. And so it becomes unsightly. They just don't look as fresh. That will eventually lead to some decay. And in this case, when we see the product in the net bags like that, we have to handle them carefully. The person holding them held them up. And what happens is then the zucchini squash are pressed against the net, and the net is going to cut into the surface. So really those we have to lift and handle very carefully because of the potential damage by that net. Now here are a couple other examples. We have some cantaloupes with superficial decay. Many of these, again, the pulp inside the cantaloupe was all right, but those look downright ugly, and that's because we have the superficial mold growth. So this is an issue, especially with winter melons. They can be older, have longer time from harvest until we get them at the WIC stores. When it's not too bad and we just begin to see the superficial mold, again, we want to sell those quickly. We should always keep them cold, because those molds that are there, because of the length of time from harvest, they will grow at warmer temperatures. And so these melons, especially in the winter, we want to keep them really cold. The melons really, basically from a post-harvest standpoint, are weaker than the summer-grown fruit oftentimes. And so here, these melons are a complete loss, really. They should be thrown away because no one's going to buy them when they look like that. And then on the right, we have another example of a complete loss, and that is when the potatoes have greening like this. And of course, we want people to eat green leafy vegetables, but we don't want them to eat green potatoes. And that is because the greening in the potatoes is associated with another process, another aspect of the biology, and that is the production of toxic black alkaloids. And so it's not easy to measure them, but they are associated then with the greening. So when we see potatoes that are green like that, they should be thrown away because of the potential to have this a too high a level of these glycoalkaloids, which are toxic. And especially when we're dealing with women, infants, and children, we want to make sure that we are not selling potatoes that have green peels like this. So again, these potatoes are a complete loss and should be thrown away. Now, one thing, just going back to this, is how do we minimize that? One is turnover, one is not exposing to light, trying to minimize light exposure, and basically then that's where, if we're having that type of trouble in a store, we want to keep them on the refrigerated shelf. Oftentimes in other supermarkets you see the potatoes out in the open, and we also see greening problems. But one way to retard the development of the greening and the glycoalkaloids is to keep them colder. So again, if you're handling small potatoes and you're having that kind of problem, then keep them cold, keep them away from light, use that kind of protective packaging that doesn't allow them to be exposed to light. So here are a few more examples, and on the upper left then, or on the left, sorry, we have some products. Again, here we have some watermelons, we have some tomatoes, we have honeydew melons. They probably do not need or are benefited by refrigeration. They're simply occupying very valuable real estate there inside the cooler, and they really could be held outside. And then on the right, simply I say, would you buy this bag of spinach? I know I certainly wouldn't. You have a lot of breakage, but more you have yellowing. And so we know that yellowing in a leafy green like spinach is a sign that the product is old and or it's had very poor temperature management. So if you remember back to the aspect of microbial food safety and decay, here we're going to have more bacterial decay. And so this is a product that is riskier because of that. So we do not want to see that type of product on the display shelf. A few more photos here, and this has to do with technology that we do use sometimes in post-harvest handling, and that is called modified atmospheres. The word's on the bottom right here. So modified atmosphere refers to when we are changing the composition of the air. Usually around our products we have normal air, which contains 21% oxygen and only a very small amount of carbon dioxide. But if we put a product in a package, such as those cantaloupes or the avocados on the left, we can create a modified atmosphere where now the oxygen is lower than normal and the carbon dioxide is higher. So on the left in particular, if we look at those avocados, we do not want to see something like an avocado in a completely sealed bag. And the reason for that is avocados have a very high rate of respiration, that breathing process. So they're taking in oxygen and they're producing carbon dioxide at very high levels. So if we enclose them in a plastic bag like that, what will happen is they will run out of oxygen and they will ferment. The carbon dioxide will inhibit their ripening, and so they will perform very poorly for the consumers. One thing is to tie the bag loosely, and I understand sometimes you want to contain 2 avocados, sell them as a unit, but the other simple thing would be to make sure the bags has some holes. So you could tie the end of the bag, but just puncture, put a couple holes in the bag, and in that way you ensure that the bag would never run out of oxygen or build up too much CO2. So I saw that practice many times, and again, that is risky for avocados. In the store, the personnel, you as personnel in the store, won't see a problem with it, but your customers will. They'll take it home and there'll be avocados that will discolor, will ripen, etc. Okay. Now on the right here, we're showing melons, and this is a technique called bag and box. And here what happens is the melons are cooled, then they're put in a specially designed bag. some of the air is evacuated, really, so we minimize the air volume inside, and the bag is closed, and now the bag, carbon dioxide builds up in the bag, and again the carbon dioxide is coming from the biology of the product, from its normal rate of respiration, and that carbon dioxide in the bag helps to retard microbial growth. But when you receive it at the store, what you want to do is open the bag and allow the product then to be exposed to normal air, so that it will begin to color. These melons typically come in very green, so we want them to have a more normal color, and we want them to develop their more normal aroma. So we do want to take them out of those bags, but again, market them quickly, otherwise we will have that problem of the superficial mold growth, because the whole purpose of the bag is basically to retard the growth of molds on the surface of the melon. And when we open the bag, we still do want to keep them cold, or the melons will develop the superficial molds like I showed you in the previous photo. Another area where modified atmospheres are used are in many of the salad products, and in the WIC stores you're having broccoli florets, you're having some different cut salads. So those all depend on depend on modified atmosphere packaging to maintain their freshness, etc. And there are some issues with sometimes with their texture and their flavor and things like that, especially if the product is not held at low temperature. So all of these products need to be held as low a temperature as possible, and they always should be on the refrigerated shelf. Then we have another group of products that are very similar, but these are not cut. So these you will see in different types of packaging, but in this type of packaging we do not have a modified atmosphere. Those romaine lettuce in the middle there with the blue stripe at the bottom, they have holes in the bag. The clam shells have small crenulations or perforations that allow air. So in that case, we're not depending on a modified atmosphere to maintain the visual quality, but we still require low temperature to maintain the overall quality of the product. Okay, so two different ways of packaging. So that brings me to another topic, and that is, we know that in these modified atmosphere packaged lettuce salad products, that temperature is very important. But how do we measure the temperature of the products? You know, we can't just take a temperature probe and stick it into a product. So what we do is we take the probe and we put it between two of the bags. So here, Yeli from one of the Alameda stores is measuring the temperature of the product. And of course, I put here in parentheses, we should be doing this in the cold room, but for the purpose of the demonstration here, just how we're measuring it, we were doing it on the checkout counter. But normally, you would be receiving the product, and I was emphasizing to the store personnel that when they receive products such as these packaged salads, they do want to check the temperature of those products, and they should receive them at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or below. And really, they should not accept them if they're at a higher temperature. That is a general protocol for this type of product. And so the way to check the temperature again is to place that temperature probe then in between two of the bags and hold it there for a minute or so inside the cold room to get an adequate estimate of the temperature of that product. So the question here is, what's a good temperature range for these products? And the answer is as close to 32 as possible. And that applies to all the other fresh cut value added items. And then another note here is that I complain a bit about seeing iceberg lettuce in the bags, and the reason is because we want to see more nutritious lettuces, and the darker green the lettuce, the more nutritious it will be. And so we really want to see really offering more of the romaine types and some of the other leafy lettuces. Now, during the workshops that we conducted, there were many questions and discussions, and here I made a list of some of the common ones just to go through and make sure that we're very clear about these. One is a typical refrigerated temperature. We measured a few of these and they vary a little bit, but typically it's around 40 to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, between 4 and 5 degrees Celsius. A typical ambient temperature can vary a lot more, and certainly it varies by season. And so it can be anywhere from 12 to 15 Celsius, or about 55 to 59, even lower sometimes in the winter months. And in the summer, it can be over 100 degrees inside if there isn't air conditioning. With air conditioning, typically we would only measure up to about 80 degrees in some of the stores in Riverside County. But it depends on air conditioning and where that's located. So the ambient temperature can vary a lot, and again there, the higher the temperature, the more rapidly the produce is going to deteriorate, as everyone's aware. Should limes be stored in the refrigerator? And the answer is no. If you have very hot, dry conditions, they will lose moisture, and you could get by with 1 or 2 days in the refrigerator, but you want to certainly minimize the time that they are in the refrigerator. Should he come up and be stored in the refrigerator? And here I can say never, do not store it in the refrigerator, because you will get internal browning. And even at warm temperatures, it holds up perfectly well as a root vegetable with a good peel, good skin. What's the correct storage temperature for bagged salads? As close to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius as possible. If the avocados are ripe, yes, they can be stored in the refrigerator for a few days. If the avocados are still hard, still green, they should not be stored in the refrigerator, because doing that will inhibit their ability to ripen later. Cantaloupes and honeydew melons do produce a lot of ethylene, and so therefore we would not want to have them next to the watermelon, which is very susceptible to ethylene. So again, right there in the melon group, we have products that are damaged by ethylene and some that produce a lot of ethylene. So making sure that we keep the cantaloupes and the honeydews in one area and the watermelons in another is important.